Probably joining. So again, good evening to everyone and welcome to the AAD sessions. For those who don't know me, my name is Beatrice De Carli. I am a reader in urbanism at the School of Art, Architecture and Design of London Metropolitan University and the Deputy Director of the Research Centre Cube that hosts this event. The session this evening is part of our AAD Books series and will focus on a publication series produced within the school called the ARCSR Journal. And with us to talk about this series are my colleagues, Dr. Tang and Professor Maurice Mitchell, and I know that also many other colleagues who have contributed and participated in the series are present in the meeting. So to introduce our speakers, Tang is a reader in architecture at AAD. Her work focuses on the nature of collaborative hands-on making and the culture of bottom-up city making, explored and examined through teaching, research, and live projects in India, Nepal, Sierra Leone, Greece, and the UK. And Maurice Mitchell is professor at AAD, where he teaches the MArch Unit 6. He also teaches at the Centre for Alternative Technology in Wales and has taught at the Architectural Association, Oxford Brookes University, and the Development Planning Unit of UCL. His area of interest lies in the interplay between technical and everyday cultural factors in the production and sustainability of the built environment, particularly in situations of rapid change and scarce resources. So together, Bo and Maurice are co-authors of the book Loose Fit City, The Contribution of Bottom-Up Architecture to Urban Design and Planning, which was published by Routledge in 2018. And the book synthesizes their shared approach to bottom-up architecture. And importantly, Bo and Maurice also co-lead the Architecture of Rapid Change and Scarce Resources, or ARCSR, which is a studio-based teaching and research group at London Met, and one of the pillars of our own research center, Cube. So ARCSR involves both staff and students in joint research, design, and making, and obviously we'll be hearing more about it from Bo and Maurice. And what this session will do is to discuss the role of their annual booklet, the ARCSR Journal series, in providing continuity of content and also in building thematic and theoretical discourse across time and space, so linking together the work of ARCSR students and the researchers, and then seeding PhD theses, books, and exhibitions. So we invited Bo and Maurice to sort of host this event and to participate in this conversation, because we are hoping through this as well, obviously, to discuss the work in itself of the ARCSR Journal series, and also to have a broader conversation on the synergies between teaching and research, and on the value of involving students as researchers in their own right. And so in looking at these continuities between teaching and research. So the session will include a presentation, and then we will have ample time for discussion. And just as a technical note, I think not everyone can access the chat in the call. So if you have any questions or comments, but you cannot access the chat, please do raise your hand and you can speak during the meeting. So thank you very much to Bo and Maurice for joining us this evening. I'm really happy we are hosting this session. And I'll now leave the floor to you.
Thanks, Beatrice, and thank you for the introduction. Give me a minute just to share my screen. Okay, can you see full screen?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so this is the title of a very short talk that I am going to give today, so that we have a lot of time for discussion, hopefully. For those of you who don't know who we are, ARCSR is a teaching and a research platform which produces teaching and contributes to teaching practice in an emerging area of pedagogy. As a teaching agenda, our studios engage proactively with transitional communities in a rapidly changing, under-resourced local situation, devising imaginative responses to specific cultural and technical issues. And as a method of study and design, we approach this through the lens of the architect as detective, narrator or storyteller, and maker, or craftsperson. We've also developed a theory of loose fit design that takes into account the fourth dimension of time. So the collaboration and involvement of ARCSR students and researchers with communities and with NGOs through situated fieldwork in a particular geographical location over an extended period of time allows us to establish settings within which we can uncover the matters of concern or the topics of research. And this has led to live projects with permanent architectural interventions, such as schools and water and sanitation buildings, that continue the long-term physical and cultural engagement with place. So the teaching, research and practice work in parallel and not in series, enabling each to have an independent pathway with opportunities for crossover and overlapping and joining together at particular times. However, they're never separate. So this diagram just shows some of the sites, the settings that we've worked in over the last 20 years now, and some of the live projects that have run in parallel to that. And here are just some of the projects that we've done over the years. You can find out more on our website, www.arcsr.org. So the ARCSR Journal is a collection of studio or unit and research publications. It started off as a way for students and researchers to collectively document situated fieldwork in a particular transitional urban setting, with contributions from the postgraduate Unit 6 and undergraduate Studio 7 that we teach, as well as MA ARCSR and MA by project students, and more recently PhD students. We've established an ethical alternative route to mainstream professional practice through our MA and PhD by project or practice. This diagram shows the ARCSR vertical teaching model here at London Met. This has opened up viable and sustainable avenues for further study and practice for graduates in areas where architects have not been able to sustain practice previously. ARCSR also provides this vertical route of study through the School of Architecture in the ARCSR area by extending the offering of the postgraduate MArch ARCSR unit number 6. Exchange between students in different courses and units and studios is facilitated and encouraged through joint field trips, crits, group work, and research and live project opportunities throughout the year. The ARCSR Journal supports this process and links the different levels of study through collective and collaborative recording and documentation of the student work. Students and researchers work together to produce the booklet, and in doing so, share the discourse throughout the academic year. We further mesh this with a hands-on learning by making course that we run at the Centre for Alternative Technology in Wales called A Way of Building. So you can see here that we teach all the way from actually first year to PhD in architecture, and there are 3 major studios that have been involved over the years: Unit 6, Studio 7 and Studio 3. So taking the example of our early work in India from about 2006 to 2013, we were able to establish the student discourse sufficiently to act in partnership with local NGOs over a number of years to allow live projects to emerge as a rich setting for MA and PhD projects. By documenting the work annually in the ARCSR Journal, a geographical area of investigation explored by undergraduate and postgraduate students over a number of years, working in close collaboration with local NGOs and communities, has sparked a particular live project grown out of which successful PhD study has also grown. And that includes the PhD that I did in India as well. So you can, hopefully this diagram is clear enough to explain how the journals you see on the left link to the live projects that emerged and led to PhD discourse. And in turn, these PhDs have continued to develop and have generated further live projects, which feed back into the ARCSR teaching and research discourse. So these are some of the live projects carried out as PhDs, which have continued after. The development of topics documented in the ARCSR Journal has also led to two major ARCSR publications, books. The first, Learning from Delhi, which was published by Routledge in 2010, and Loose Fit City, which was published in 2018. So I hope that this has offered a quick overview of the ARCSR area and how the journal fits within our teaching, research and practice. For the second part of this presentation, I'd like to focus more on the journal itself as a collaborative documentation of situated fieldwork. This is carried out using various methods by students and researchers through transect walks and physical and cultural surveys, field trip interventions and workshops, exhibitions of student proposals and spatial imaginaries, and small hands-on making projects and events that we do in the field. So I'm going to show you a few examples from 4 geographical settings in Nepal, Sierra Leone, Greece and Calabria. So starting in Kathmandu, our work in Nepal began with a summer scoping study in Kathmandu in 2014, identifying potential settings and transect walks which were documented in this publication, this ARCSR Journal Volume 9 called Scoping Kathmandu. This, the Volume 9 journal then became the basis for the academic programme in 2014 and 15 in our studios. The thematic focus was on providing an infrastructure for shared space and city making on marginal land and blighted places left behind by the rapidly changing city topography. Undergraduate, postgraduate and MA students worked in these settings during their November field trip. Here shown in the image in a place called Balaju, one of the more northern sites in Kathmandu, students engaged with local youth to construct a small bamboo shelter and benches during their 2-week field trip. This was documented in the March of the City. Following on, student researchers returned to Kathmandu in summer of 2015, where they extended the previous year's ARCSR investigation into from the centre of Kathmandu to the southern edge of the Kathmandu Valley. They documented the extraordinary changes taking place following the massive and devastating earthquake in April 2015. During this trip, and encouraged by NGO Bongamati Foundation Nepal, they presented their work from the previous year in an exhibition to the local community residents. This is documented in Kathmandu Edgelands, Volume 10. So our return to Bongamati in November of the same year, 2015, reunited old and new students with the community and saw the collaborative construction of a bamboo patty shown here. Patty is a rest house. The next year, students brought their work back to Bongamati in the summer of 2016, presenting spatial imaginaries to local residents to facilitate discussion about rebuilding of the settlement and fractured landscapes. The next visit to Bongamati and Kathmandu in November 2016 saw students engaging in a hands-on making event with residents to imagine the rebuilding of a single dwelling on a small plot that had been, the house had been destroyed by the earthquake. This long-term engagement with the setting in Kathmandu led to PhD research and a journal paper which brought together topics of urban agriculture, migration, rivers, and city making. The second example setting is Freetown, Sierra Leone, where we've been long engaged since 2008. Our involvement here began with a brief for the design of a primary school, collaborating with local NGO CESO. The school was constructed in 2010 to 11, with involvement from ARCSR researchers at various stages of the process between 2008 and 2012. Students carried out a furniture making workshop in 2013, and surveys of Creo houses and hill station houses. Recording of this work in the ARCSR journals from 2008 led to the publication, The Architecture of 3 Freetown Neighbourhoods, which was a collaboration with the British Council, and a parallel exhibition which was held at their headquarters in Freetown and was also presented in London. Students present a proposed urban imaginaries for a new school of architecture and a new national museum in Freetown in 2013, resulting in an MOU, or Memorandum of Understanding, between the University of Sierra Leone and London Met in 2014. Following a difficult period with the Ebola outbreak and mudslides from 2014 to 2017, ARCSR returned to Freetown in 2018 after a 4-year break. The work from the past decade was consolidated in a paper in the Journal of Urban Design, and we're now developing a new research project called Lines Through the City. This has been supported by internal funding and has led to new PhD research through the newly created Vice Chancellor's Scholarship Fund. I'll only talk very briefly about the last two examples. In central Athens, we have been exploring a number of settings where a large number of refugees have landed when arriving in the city since 2015. The image here is a collage of surveys from our students and researchers produced from 2016 to 2020, showing the citywide areas of interest and the scope of districts where refugees are settling. The red line is a walk between Leone on the west and Exarchia on the east, linking these settings together. And these are some of the ARCSR journals which document these settings in Athens. Building on the work that was carried out pre-pandemic, we returned to Athens this year, actually just a few weeks ago during the Easter break, with a very diverse group of staff and students from across London Met to focus on the area shown in red in the neighbourhood of Exarchia. This project was supported by Erasmus Plus funding and addressed topics of community, architecture, migration and participation, which then also links our Athens work with Calabria. So here in Calabria, a similar and even richer programme of student activities has been carried out in Calabria since 2016, led by Sandra Denique Polcher and Jane McAllister, in close collaboration with Rita Adamo and local organisation La Sepi and the local community in Belmonte, Calabro. This image here is just a snapshot of the types of events that undergraduate and postgraduate students have been involved in during studio and unit field trips and summer workshops documented in the ARCSR journals. I hope that perhaps Jane and Sandra are here today and will be able to offer their perspective too in the discussion after. So I've gone through, I suppose, the evolution of the journal quite quickly. Over the years, the ARCSR Journal has grown from a 50-page booklet back in 2006 to a nearly 200-page publication in 2021. The most recent volume of the ARCSR Journal, called Arrival City, includes student proposals, which is something that's quite new. And whilst the situated field work is still collated by students working in groups following the field trips in the middle of the year, the annual studio publication is now completed at the end of the year to include these student proposals, and the journal continues to evolve. So all of the ARCSR Journal volumes are digital and can be downloaded via our website. We're currently working on last year's publication, which has been slightly delayed, but we expect this to be published at the end of this month. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Boo. So I think we can now open to a broader conversation, unless Maurice, you also wanted to add anything now or prefer to?
I think that Bo's covered everything pretty clearly, and I think that the nature of the journal illustrates our approach, which the vertical nature of the arrangement, so teaching and research as a singular activity is important to us. And that the work we do is spread both horizontally, geographically that is, and vertically in terms of the different stages of the educative process is also important to us. And I think that is a way of maximizing the benefits of our university, as opposed to a Russell Group university, where there's a very clear separation between teaching and research, and where one is expected to raise funding for the research element, for the empirical work, for the field work, and where it's perhaps more difficult to do it in our university. And if you're not in the Russell Group or not in a more recognized institution. So I think one of the real benefits of working in a teaching institution is that we can do original research and we can produce discourse based on real pragmatic experience by making these links. And I think we've shown that in this book, in this journal, and that's what I'd like to hear people's opinions about how, whether they agree with us or whether they have similar experience, or whether that might be spread across the university a little more. I mean, that to me is the front line of the conversation, but I'll leave it to other people to bring that up. Thank you.
Thank you. And I see we have Bob, you have your hand raised.
Thank you, Beatrice. It's great just to reflect on this amazingly 20 years of effort. I was struck by Bo's presentation around the period that we were in Kathmandu, which really felt we felt being in the right place at the right time. But strangely, after our first year in Kathmandu, there was a terrible earthquake, and much of the many beautiful buildings we'd seen the previous year had been destroyed by the earthquake, and many houses. And I just made a little note here about a rather marvelous opportunity that arose to help in the rebuilding of some of those houses, partly on the experience that we'd had in the Sabta Gevra, where we'd realised that the manner in which dwellings were constructed were on parcels of land which were built independently of what was happening around. So there was no concept, for example, of a party wall or a shared ownership of any infrastructure. Everybody had to find their own resources for their own dwellings. And in Kathmandu, we were found initially 17 families who we got to know quite well, and we did various schemes for rebuilding their houses based on interviews with those families and how those rebuildings might go ahead. And I went back the next year to make progress on that. And what we really found, which I think is an interesting side to all of this making process, the live project process, was that I had not, or we had not, or mainly me actually, I hadn't really understood the importance of establishing ownership initially. And whilst I was there very briefly for about 3 weeks, was trying to establish ownership so the houses could be rebuilt. And that proved to be the most impossible and insurmountable stumbling block for us to generate a live project, which I believe if we had managed to establish and so recognize the importance of us getting documentation together and helping those house owners to put their case to the various authorities and regulatory bodies, we would have stood a really, really good chance of making a significant contribution in Bangamati, particularly, and the surrounding villages. So I just wanted to say that I think there's a sort of an element which runs through all of these projects about us finding land, finding space, and as it were being given permission. I'm thinking here of the quarry buildings that we built in Navi Mumbai, establishing a sort of a right, if you like, a right to build at a very, very early stage. It would give the projects that we'd worked very hard on many years a much, much greater chance of being realised. And I think that's a lesson that I would be very keen to follow through if we were ever in a situation again where we could offer to help a group build a building. Sorry, I went on for a rather long time. Apologies. I always do.
Thank you. Matthew, did you want to come in?
Well, I have some different questions and comments, but I mean, I don't know if Bo or Maurice want to respond to Bob first, but otherwise I can just go on.
No, please do, Matthew.
Okay. I mean, I think one of the things I like about this this event tonight is obviously you've been producing these documents for years, and I remember when I first started at London Metropolitan, and I'm here tonight partly just because I'm a colleague, but also in my role as acting head of research, while Nick Temple is on research leave. But in my time here, I've seen numerous iterations of this publication, and I think it's great that we are talking about it this evening as a journal. And I would certainly love to discuss, possibly right now or otherwise in another event, how this is a journal and how it not only challenges what a journal might be, but also the kind of normative version of a journal. You know, a journal normally has aims and scope. It has an editorial committee, which you can think of as the community. And the implication is that there's an ethos and a number of methods, and all of those different things ARCSR absolutely has, and yet it doesn't present its journal in quite that way. So I think of this really as a wonderful opportunity. I mean, I would love to hear some comments on what the aims and scope is, because I think there is a mission really behind this journal. Obviously, there's an editorial community, although it's not formalized, and maybe that's a decision. Regarding methods and ethos, of course, those methods appear in the variety of publications and in the teaching, but certainly the integration and the resistance to, if you like, delineation between what research and teaching might mean is part of the ethos and the methods of the ARCSR Journal as well. So all of these things make it distinctive and suggest in some ways that perhaps it's a good time to talk to an academic publisher about what this journal might be, because I don't know another journal that captures this particular niche. So that's my first question or comment. I have two more, so if you don't mind, shall I just go on? Well, I'll just go on. The second one is I hear what Maurice says about funding and how we're not a Russell Group university, and therefore we don't have that luxury. And yet, ARCSR is the most successful research group we have when it comes to applying for funding, either internally or externally. Every single year you win funding that other groups don't win, and manage to sustain and reproduce your work through university support as well as external support. And in addition to that, we're on a trajectory as a school that is improving the funding environment. So just this morning at the Architecture Management Group, I reported on the various funding initiatives that we have. which currently this year, this academic year, amounts to around £710,000 worth of successful or bids that have been submitted or are in the final process. Excuse me, Beatrice, if it's not been submitted yet, but like people are busy applying for funding, and they're following in the pathway that ARCSR has successfully beaten out. So I certainly don't think that we should think of ourselves as the poor cousins. And also we should take advantage of the improved framework of support that the university now provides. And if we have ambitions, we should ask for support from colleagues and the university in doing so, and be absolutely more ambitious. And so that's the second point about funding, which suggests that if we have good ideas, we need to insist on support for them. And then thirdly, just to look at ARCSR since the time that I first did crits for Unit 6 many years ago, and then finally did some reviews of the work externally, and finally came and joined the team, and now am a big supporter within the university structure. Isn't it a good time to think about an ARCSR conference? Because this community is not a small local community, it's a global community with all of this reproduction of ideas. I mean, you mentioned the work that has been going on through the Calabria crossings. It's very interesting to see that Rita Adamo recently completed her PhD completely after the model of a PhD study piloted by ARCSR through you, Bo, apart from other graduates of the program. So not only are we producing our own doctoral research through this teaching research pathway, but also sending out the message to a broader community. And this capability, it's a moment of fantastic recognition given the reappearance and resurgence of interest in research of this kind globally. So that we're finding actually we're in demand as a community. We're beating at an open door, not a closed door. And I think a conference could be something we should certainly think about planning, if not next year, the year after that, because now would seem to be the time when we can offer something to that global community. So I'll stop right there. I know I said a lot, but those 3 points. What is the journal? Maybe it is a more real journal, not a local journal. Secondly, what could be the kind of response that we get if we put our funding bids together with university support? And secondly, what about a conference? I'm not expecting answers, but those are definitely my suggestions.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for your suggestions, as always. I mean, to address the first point about what kind of journal it is. I mean, first of all, we should probably credit you with it being a journal in the first place, because prior to I think it was your suggestion back in 2018 or 19, to us, it was a collection of publications that we used purely in-house, although they were available, to download for anybody who was interested. So I think even in the last 4 or 5 years, it's evolved quite significantly. And we are very open to developing it in more ways, and it continues to evolve as I've suggested. But I mean, what we continue to do, though, day to day is simply to use it as a resource in the best way that we feel is useful to us and to the students for our research and our teaching and practice. So I think if we can think in a clever way of getting more resources to help do this, I think this goes with both your questions 2 and 3, that there's definitely possibility and scope for where it might go. So yes, I absolutely agree with you that it would be great to have an ARCSR conference. I think we proposed one a couple of years ago and then panicked at the last minute that we just didn't have the resources to make it happen. But I think now we have more members and more people affiliated with the group. It would be great to see how we could do that in a way that supports everybody and involves everybody and is inclusive.
Yes, I agree with Bo. I think the journal, obviously, it's a dynamic vehicle, and it's come a long way, and it could continue to go. I would hope that it wouldn't move too far away from the teaching process, because the discourse is generated by the work of the students on field trips each year. And although we may set a theme at the beginning of the year, it becomes entrenched and validated by that field trip. And then that is recorded. So, I mean, I would hate to lose that because it's a vehicle for teaching. It's a vehicle for generating original research. I think a journal that was broader than that would be fantastic. Whether it's the same journal or whether it's a sister journal, I don't know. I think that's needs further conversation. And I think the conference is a great idea. So that's my reaction to that.
Just to add to that, I think yes, what Matthew's saying, the idea that it could challenge the idea of what a journal is particularly interesting to me, because, as you say, Maurice, we wouldn't want it to become a journal as we know it, which is too formalized, that it no longer becomes particularly useful for us and more of a chore to put together. But I think what we want to maintain is that collaboration between students and researchers and staff in producing it. At the moment, it's produced basically by a coalition of the willing and whoever's got time, which is why it's currently delayed. But it's important because it started off as something that was very much student-led, and when we first started the journal, that staff didn't get involved. It was purely produced by the students, and it's only over the years that we've had to play more of a role in editing it and writing a much longer forward to introduce the theme for the year and things like that.
Bob, did you want to? Sorry, I saw you had your hand up.
Bo just, I think, made the point that, of course, initially the editorial board for each of the booklets were the students, and we had a rather serious hour or so at the end of every trip where people were either volunteered or sometimes were volunteered to carry out certain tasks. And what I think is interesting, and maybe Matthew had some influence on that, is that it's become a more slick, maybe a slightly more professional production, which instead of being concluded very rapidly after we came back from each of the trips, has become a sort of year-long thing, which appears at the end of the academic year. And for me, that was that has some advantages and some disadvantages. It's a better document, certainly, and reads better, and with the far fewer typographical errors that always used to amuse in the early editions. But on the other hand, we always encourage the students to include it as part of their work when they submitted their portfolio at the end of the year. And I felt that was a really good connection between the research, if you like, and the document production and the students' output, and they get a reward, if you like, for putting a tremendous number of hours in to make these booklets happen. So it would be sad if that got lost. It could get diluted a bit, but lost would be sort of sad, I think.
Yeah, what we found, Bob, on that point is that in the last couple of years, the situation has changed a little. We have more students who work. I estimate it to be about 90% of our studio work now, compared to maybe 10 when we started. And teaching weeks have been squeezed, and things are changing. And we found that there was a lot of pressure on the students to try and publish this, you know, get it printed and everything else during the year in the last 2 years. They still do mini booklets. Last year they did a little live project booklet about an amphitheatre building that they constructed or designed at that point. And this year they put together a precedent booklet and a survey precedent booklet based on their field trip. So while I agree with you that it is a shame that the booklet isn't completed in the middle of the year and included in the portfolios, I think we have to be also realistic to the situation and able to adapt to it for the benefit of the students as well.
I do think that we can adapt. I mean, I do think that if groups of students can produce booklets of their joint work, they can then be a draft of a section of the final thing, and that it may be that the final thing has proper funding and has people to put the final thing together, and they can even invite outside contributions. But it would take quite a, I think it will have to be well conducted to make sure that it isn't weighted in one direction or another, that it does contribute to an overall directional theme. I think that's what we would need to do. I mean, I think Matthew has quite rightly identified opportunities, but I think the richness comes from its emergence from teaching and field trips, and that's what we shouldn't lose, because otherwise we'll be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But I still would encourage the attempt to make that work, because I think everything always has to change, and that's the direction that we can certainly try to go next.
Thanks. I also had I guess there are two. One is maybe more of a comment than a question, but a reflection, not a comment maybe. There was wanted to go back to a point that you raised quite in the beginning, and that Maurice was raising in just after the presentation, in asking whether this way of linking teaching and research and publishing as well might become a model that is of interest to others and adopted by others, either within the university and beyond. And reflecting on that, I was thinking, you know, it's very interesting how you describe the journal as a vehicle that supports these horizontal and vertical connections and connections between places and stages of the work. And I found that, for instance, the Athens drawing that you showed is a very apt representation of that, as you were describing it as a survey that emerged out of collaging the different surveys and drawings that different students and researchers were making. And that seemed in itself like to demonstrate this way of producing knowledge that you have, that is about us bringing together different people and contributions. And it seems to me that part of somehow the success, it's not the right word, but maybe the success of this model, of this way of working and of this way of conceiving research and the links between teaching and research is actually links very, very closely to how you conceive and practice architecture, because which is also horizontal and collaborative and co-produced. So this is more like I was wondering to what extent can this become a model for others, or to what extent it's actually so, in a very nice way, very specific to the work you do, because you somehow seem to practice teaching and research in the same way you practice architecture. And then there's this sort of forms of collaboration that you manage to enable in all these different environments that are very unique, I find. And I don't know to what extent, if someone is in a discipline or practices even architectural design in a way that is not so collaborative, like it might be a lot more difficult to see these connections that you make between teaching and research, because you do see students as peers, you bring different people in to bring their contribution. And so it was just a reflection on where do I see somehow the uniqueness of this, because I think it's also something that can be, as we're all saying, I guess, valorized and talked about in these terms. And then on the side of this, I had a much smaller sort of question, because I was wondering, about also the connections. Obviously, a lot of the work in the journal is grounded in the units and the studios, and that's the core of it. And I was wondering if there are any connections that you made over the years to history and theory teaching in the school as well. And I was wondering about this because obviously, like, it does feel, as someone who's quite new to the school, it does feel now that as areas of teaching, they're quite separate in many ways, like design and theory. And I'm aware that you used to teach other modules, including the ones that I teach. And this year I've enjoyed a lot the crossovers between changing places and your unit, and the fact that students were making those connections themselves. So I was wondering just if there might be scope to explore that connection too, and think about how do we bring in these other modules or this module or other similar contributions more in close dialogue. And maybe the journal is a space to do that as well, and to look at those essays alongside the design work.
I would welcome that.
I would remind, no, not remind, and I'll describe a rather marvelous moment where we had with Hector, who was making a sort of memory film, which I believe in a couple of weeks' time will be one of the subjects of a further talk in this series. And we, on arrival in Athens, we managed to liaise with Hector, and we went on a very, very interesting journey around Athens with Hector, who has been filming there for, I think, maybe more than a year, maybe 2 years. And he introduced us to another way of looking at the city and trying to describe these sort of in-between spaces that we were personally interested in, the areas around the refugee camps, the areas where the migrants were starting to establish themselves in the city. And I think there are some really useful connections there across the school with maybe other media. We just returned from Athens, as I was saying, doing this Erasmus camp, and one of the members of our group that took part in this workshop was a filmmaker, and it was very fascinating to see a different approach, completely different way of him describing the days that we were spending together in film. And I really feel that there's a certain cross department opportunity here, and quite independently, I'm part of a little group talking about drawing at the moment with other members of other bits of the School of Architecture and other schools, and so drawing, a bit like filmmaking, is a sort of cross-disciplinary thing, which, so therefore, Beatrice, I think we can, if we put our minds to it, we could develop quite interesting cross-departmental ways of looking at these things.
Thank you. Bo, I think you're...
Yeah, no, just to add to what Bob was saying, I think it was a very interesting experience that we had recently in Athens, and very exciting for us to reflect upon now, because in a way it was a sort of experiment for what might happen if we tested our methods, I suppose, or shared our methods with those outside of architecture. So it's a bit soon for us to have processed those reflections, or really understood how the participants felt about being part of that exchange. But that's definitely something really good that you've brought up, which we will bear in mind, which hopefully will lead to more and new exciting developments moving forward, I think.
Maurice, did you want to add?
Yes, just briefly. I know we also had a carpenter come to help us with doing the furniture in Sierra Leone, so that was a cross-department collaboration. So that was one. But these things tend to be a coalition of the willing at any particular time, and so the energy tends to come from, if you advertise what you're doing and you know, then people who are interested, they need to come and say, we want to be part of this, or we can offer something. Let's see what we can do. And that's a way of working which seems to work well. I also think, Beatrice, that again, what you were suggesting there is an incredibly good idea. And what's tended to happen is that the modules that we used to run are not running anymore, and that's presumably because of numbers and the way you can attract students. And so the problem that we have is finding ways in which the subject and our approach becomes something that students want to take up, and which the university structure offers a place for us to get involved. So it's the tide of the way the university is organized that determines that, which we have very little impact on. Hang on a second, I just got to switch this off. Hang on, oh, here it is. When we came to the end of the period in Athens, we realized that what we'd done is we'd got a series of assemblies of fragments, so that because people were so different and they'd approached it in very different ways, they produced fragments, and those fragments were based on a particular setting in a particular period, and then we collaged them. So it wasn't like a master plan where everything had been planned at each scale. It was that there were just these that come from the bottom up into an imaginary which was based on a particular setting, and they didn't necessarily fit together. But in a sense, that didn't matter, because it allows everybody to talk about them as an assembly of different fragments, and therefore they became more than the sum of the parts. And I think when you were suggesting that this was the way that we did architecture, that's what it evoked in me, is that approach of stimulating imaginaries from the bottom up to produce fragments of ideas at a particular scale in a particular setting that, when assembled together, could become civic. And I think that's what we sort of understanding we're doing at the moment, having looked back on it. And that's what I understood only recently, that's what we were doing from Athens. So that's a sort of new insight, if it is an insight, that I think is emerging from what we were doing at this particular point in time. So yes, it does chime with what you're saying, that it's the way we practice as well as the way we research, as well as the way we teach, and we're now putting that into words. So thank you. That's.
Thank you. What did you want to go back?
Yeah, I just want to, it had me thinking about settings, and how the settings are something that offer more scope for people and others to be involved, or to broaden this work that we're doing beyond just ARCS and the studio. I was reminded when Bob mentioned Hector, I'd totally forgotten about that exchange, that not only did Hector join us on one of the early trips we did to Athens, but we followed that up with he ran 3 seminars for the students on particular topics that had come up based in Athens, and did those in the weeks following, in the weeks and months following the field trip when we returned to London. I think that added an extra dimension to their work, which was very much coming from the history and theory discourse. So that was just the point I wanted to make. The other point I wanted to say was just that we have a few students, former students and current students in the room, and I wondered if students who have been involved in the production of the booklets over the years, and I wondered if they had something to say about how they felt it may or may not have contributed to their studies, being involved in that process. But also we have a couple of people who were in Athens with us as well, and I open the floor to their thoughts about that too.
Thank you. Is it Michael? My pronunciation, Michael. You're on mute.
Okay, yeah. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, lovely. Yeah. So I have a reflection and a quick question, but very briefly. Thank you very much, firstly, for your talk and for your booklets, because I found it very useful. And actually, even before we went to Athens, I made a little research about the booklets, and I went to this website, and there are actually only two things comes to my mind. The things reflects to the same thoughts which you mentioned before, Yubo. It was that one of them was made like 20 years ago, and when I was in Athens, I was always thinking, what is happen if I went there like, let's say, 20 years ago, because then you have obviously like different people. The city is different, refugees as well. But when we're doing this lecture in a college in Athens, there was mentioned that before the elections there was 20 squads for the refugees. Now in Athens there are only 3 squads. So like the research will be completely different. Yeah, and the second thought, it was just I found it very useful because it's some kind of the knowledge ready to use, because somebody else went to Athens, somebody went to Nepal, and it's easy for not only students but for architects in general to get this knowledge and just use it. So it's like super useful. And yeah, following this lead, I wanted to ask you because you mentioned in your presentation, in your diagram, about the project in Nepal, and there was mention about the Studio 3 for the people from London Met and also bachelors. Could you just tell us how does it work, and just people from the Studio 3 can go to Nepal, or the project are still valid? I just wonder about it. It's very interesting, so I think I would love to hear about it.
Sure, Michael. No, Nepal, we haven't worked in Nepal for a number of years, and we don't have any intention to go back there anytime soon. But if you're talking about Studio 3, and I think Sandra's had to leave or can't speak, Studio 3 have been working in Calabria for a number of years, and I think are continuing to do so in the next few years. So she maybe would be able to talk to you more about that if you wanted to ask her about Calabria and Studio 3 and the connections to ARCSR. There are Calabria students who work as a sort of satellite group within Unit 6 as well. So there is still that connection across postgraduate and undergraduate for Studio 3 and Unit 6. I hope that answers your question. But thank you for your reflections on the booklet. It also reminded me that the importance of printing the booklet, because everything's going digital, and we make these booklets available to everybody digitally, but we do print every year 15 copies, both for our own collections, but as to be used as a physical resource on future field trips. We found it to be really useful to have them with you when you're doing your field work, particularly if there's a language barrier, that it helps. It's a very easy way to communicate what it is you're doing there in a foreign place as a stranger and outsider, when you're trying to engage with the community. And for the participants, I think on the Athens trip that we did in Easter, it was both that and a way of becoming familiar with the way we work and what we've done so far in Athens, so that they could build on that rather than starting from scratch in a very short amount of time.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think Hassan, did you have a comment?
We can't hear you, Hassan. You might need to take the headset off.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Usually this is a bit worse of a mic, but so I've personally had a few different experiences with the journals. So my first interaction with the journals was before I even became a student. I came across the journal when looking at the different units that London Met offers. And looking specifically at Unit 6, I came across the journals kind of as an inspiration for the choice I made to actually come to London Met. I knew that through the journals and the work produced in the journals that actually this is a style of architecture I want to get into, because traditionally in a lot of other universities, the way that architecture is presented, at least going through practices in part 1, part 2, part 3, the traditional route, research isn't really described as a potential avenue. So that was one experience as pre-student. And then as a student, using those books as kind of discussed, the journals are used to kind of describe to us how we should go about this kind of detective method while we're on these research trips. And that was really useful. So when we were in Athens for the first time, having these booklets and journals as references to kind of take along with us, see how work previously has been done for us, kind of gave us a catalyst to how we should kind of go forward in our own research. And then following from that, another experience I had was as an editor to quite a few of the booklets now. So 2 of the booklets presented here, and I've slightly helped with the booklet that's coming up. Being able to look at kind of the different students' work, especially because ASARCS works in kind of different locations, being able to see that kind of cross in methodology and cross in ethos across the different sites and different year groups, and working with undergrads and PhD students at the time was an incredibly beneficial thing in making me realize that I can pursue architecture through research, but also not necessarily removing the practice of it. And an important thing about the journals is that it does combine the field research that we do, the potential proposals that students come up with in their year, and then also live projects that come out of those proposals. And that actually was a thing that kind of was the main catalyst for me deciding to do a PhD and pursue a different route to architecture that wasn't necessarily ascribed to me when I first began this journey back when I was 18 years old and told that the route is part 1, part 2, part 3, and that's the only way I can pursue architecture, especially the type of architecture we do in ARCSR.
Thank you, Hasan. Matthew, yes.
Yeah, I just have a couple of last things to say from my side, but it's great to hear from Hasan, because I think this idea of regenerating the debate is really important. You know, we talk about how there's this thread from research to teaching, but of course the students who are taught within this ethos or within the framework of this ethos are the lifeblood of what comes next. And if it's a journal, it has to obviously be flexible and open to change, as Maurice has both suggested and rejected to an extent. So I think that tension is it's a very healthy tension. But also, I think I mean, as it happens, I had lunch today with our old friend Peter Carl, who was very involved in changing the research culture here at London Met some time ago. And I think it would be a great moment for the ARCSR Journal to give Peter Carl a call and say, how about some reflections, or why don't we have a conversation? And also the broader, you know, with regard to what Beatrice said about history and theory, the broader family that extends beyond the actual defined ARCSR limits, if you like. I think coming up in June, Paulo Moreira, who did some fantastic research leading to a PhD in looking at informal settlement in Luanda, won a grant from the Graham Foundation and has produced a book which will be coming out, including a four-way conversation between me, Paulo, ARCSR graduate Julia King, and Elisa Silva, a kind of four country conversation to develop issues that are very, very much in the ARCSR family. So I think these kinds of contributions, book reviews, and so forth could very much be incorporated, if not as full articles, then as letters within the ARCSR Journal. And that doesn't mean it will be diminished as a student-led opportunity. There are so many examples rather than just formal journals of different kinds of publication, whether it's Scroop from Cambridge, Footprint Journal, Places Journal, all these different journals that even have separate aspects to them, the parts that are peer-reviewed, the parts that are student-led. And I think ARCSR Journal could really be beating out its own pathway without any kind of compromise, but inviting these reflections from the past and the wider family, as well as establishing an absolutely student-led, Hossan, for example, as one of our leading new PhD students, could be editor of the student section of the journal going forwards, if that's something we want to develop. So I do think that there are these wonderful opportunities that this event has brought together. And I want to just congratulate Bo and Maurice in framing that opportunity for us. And I very much hope we can see a focus group coming out of this event today to take those ideas forwards, bearing in mind that it doesn't have to be a prey on your time. It can be an opportunity to bid for more resources, to frame that time in a way that really puts it at the center of the objectives for the next 10 years of architecture of rapid change and scarce resources.
Thank you, Matthew. I think I couldn't add anything else to this comment. I was wondering if anyone, and specifically also if Bo and Maurice, wanted to add anything else, or.
I wonder if Sandra had, as she's been so involved, if she's still there. It would be nice to hear from her.
Sandra is unable to speak at the moment.
Sent us an email saying that she has a lot of things to say and she'd like to have another opportunity. Yeah, this might pick up Matthew's suggestion that we might need to have a further discussion soon to pick up on some of these ideas.
Yes, that would be a very good idea.
I think if we're going to wrap up, Beatrice, I just wanted to thank you for inviting us to do this in the first place, because it has led to quite a lot of reflection from our part that we would never have gotten around to doing at any point. And the conversation has been very enjoyable, and the suggestions made by everybody definitely gives us a lot of food for thought and a lot of optimism for the future of the journal.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, so I think we can wrap it up here, and there will be more about the ARCSR Journal soon then. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, guys. Have a good day.